internationally known philosopher, author of The Story of Philosophy, and recently forgotten the latest book, The Age of Faith. Ha! I have a very bad lapse of memory today, Will. I was just going to admire the scenery behind us out here and say that if you looked a little bit to your left, you'd see the Statue of Liberty. Instead, let's get into philosophy, and I'd like to ask you if philosophy is actually a science.
No, science, I suppose, is the study of things that can be measured quantitatively in space and in time. You can't do that with philosophy. Philosophy is much more interesting. It deals with the intangibles like you and me.
Well, philosophy is probably the deepest of all studies.
No, I think Einstein's mathematics are much more difficult than philosophy. I'd much rather read Santayana than read Einstein.
Philosophy actually goes back, gosh, as far as written history, doesn't it?
Almost. There's a very funny passage in Confucius, who wrote about 500 years before Christ. He says, the philosophers of antiquity, you get that? Writing 500 years before Christ, he said, the philosophers of antiquity. We can trace philosophy in China back to 2000 BC, but that's as far as we can go.
Is there ever any happy marriage of the various philosophies?
Yes, they're all happily married. They all say the same thing under different phrases, different languages, and adjusted to the conditions of different times. But essentially, the philosophers agree with one another even more than the scientists do.
I didn't realize that. You have so many various interpretations of philosophy.
Well, the scientists of 100 years ago had an entirely different theory of the universe than we have now. The philosophers had the same theory that we have now, namely that we don't know anything about it, that we're little drops of water trying to understand the sea and writing enormous volumes about the history of our particular drop.
From one of the great masters of philosophy, I'd like to get your definition of philosophy when we get down to the nub of it. Just what is it?
It's an attempt to apply the whole of our experience to any part of our experience. That is, to see things in a large perspective. If, for example, it rains and you say, there goes my tennis game, spoiled, you're not a philosopher. But if you see the rain in a larger perspective and say, well, that's exactly what the soil was begging for, you're approaching philosophy. You've seen the thing in a larger perspective. And similarly, with all the tribulations and evils of life, if you could see them in a large perspective, you'd probably find some reason or excuse for them. You'd adjust yourself to them, and you'd learn to be happy even in this world.
Well, that leads me to believe there's a possibility then that people's basic philosophy are almost embedded in them when they're very young. And then it would be hard to change their basic philosophy of life after that.
I don't believe that. I used to believe that. But I'm convinced that an environment conducive to education, acquaintance with mature minds, can mold the growing mind. And I think we could take almost any sort of a child and make a philosopher out of him if we had time.
Do you then, even at your age today, sometimes change your own interpretation of your philosophy?
I should say not in the last 20 years, but that's probably because I've stopped growing.
Well, Durant, thank you very, very much for chatting with us.
Not at all.
It's a pleasure to talk to you and a pleasure to talk to one of the masters on philosophy.
Well.
And so, friends, we come to the end of your Ship's Reporter program for today. Ship's Reporter is produced on film by the National Television Guild and directed by Chick Vincent. Until next time, then, this is Jack Mangan, your Ship's Reporter, and Will Grant. That's Will Durant, whose, let's see, the book is...
The Age of Faith?
Age of Faith, the last one. And you're writing about 5 more, aren't you?
I'm writing one now on the Age of the Renaissance.
We'll never run out of ages, Will. Anyway, we both wish you and yours the smoothest in smooth sailing.
Thank you very much.